So welcome, Dr. John Agnew from UCLA. And we'd like to start off just by, since this is an IGU project, to ask if you've had any involvement with the IGU over the years into any of the political geography conferences, for example.
Yeah, I mean, more recently, not so much in the past. So I'm not sure I went to anything before the 1990s, but I went to a great meeting that was in Trieste in 2012 that was organized by Elena Dell'Agnese. And that involved probably the best field trip I've ever taken, which was through the former Yugoslavia after the conference itself. And it was tremendous. And there were participants from all over, and I enjoyed it immensely. That was very much an IGU event.
So in terms of political geography, we've chosen obviously 100 years just because it's the 100-year anniversary of the IGU. But in that time span, obviously, political geography has morphed and evolved and changed. If you were to identify the most influential theoretical innovations or movements over that time period in the discipline, what would they be?
Well, I suppose I think of political geography as being partly, within within geography, but also kind of more pan-disciplinary as well. I mean, in terms of the figures involved, some figures being identified with history or with political science, or more broadly even than that. But I think for me, political geography has come in sort of as a topic or as a subject, rather than say as a group of people. It's come in sort of bursts. I think the most important burst was really in the late 19th century and early 20th century, which was very much related to the inter-imperial rivalry of the time. So you have these figures like Halford Mackinder in England, and then somewhat later in Germany, people like Haushofer and so on. And I think that was a very important period. And of course, it's very much associated with geopolitics rather than with how we understand political geography today in a much broader sense in terms of the range of topics and the geographic scales at which people tend to do research and write about it. Then I think partly because of that association with geopolitics, things kind of went south, so to speak, after World War II. And then we see this real, I think, interesting revival of political geography beginning in the 1970s and 1980s. Mainly, at least initially, in Britain and in the United States, but very quickly in other parts of the world as well, especially in Northern Europe, in Finland and Sweden, but also in France and in Latin America. And I think that's the period of time I think we now associate most with what goes for political geography today. Everything from studying ethnic conflict and nationalism, or looking at it geographically, looking at trying to frame everything globally, but often now increasingly focusing on local and national politics in various ways. And I think also, a time of increased sort of theoretical interest and focus, looking at assumptions, trying to figure out how to do research, doing research, in fact, because I think historically, very few people in political geography had really done research as such, like collecting data or doing field work and so on. So I think for me, it's got these two big peaks, one in the early 20th century and then the other more recently. And I think we're still living through the second one.
Well, so you mentioned sort of the more recent revivals, if you will, of political geography. Are there any sort of really compelling emerging movements in the subdiscipline that you observe currently?
Well, I think over the last 20 years or so, if we can use that time frame, I think quite a few. One of which I was very much associated with, which is so-called critical geopolitics. I think increasingly interesting studies on populism and ethno-nationalism. I'm struck by how many of the more interesting and innovative studies of recent populist politics have been done from a geographical perspective, trying to look at the local, the regional, and the global sources of the rise of so-called global populism, right-wing populism in particular, around the world. And then even more recently, I think, two other things. One is the growth of so-called political ecology, which is interesting because, one of the great criticisms of late 19th, early 20th century geopolitics was that it involved a form of environmental determinism. And now we're rediscovering the environment, but more as a subject for research rather than, in terms of being any kind of, hidden determinant of how the world works. And so political ecology is studying things like water supply, climate change, the politics of climate change, and so on. I think all of these things are really important innovations recently. And then finally, the second of these recent innovations is what I would call the new materialism, which is sort of taking material life very seriously, but not so much just in the sense of, say, like Marxist historical materialism, but in terms of, the bodily realities that people face on a daily basis and so on. And Matt Coleman and I recently edited a book together on geographies of power, which is very much concerned with this final kind of area of development. So I'd say all these is really important innovations over the last 20 years.
So the health of the subdiscipline is something geographers in general, more broadly, are always sort of wringing their hands about. Any causes for concern in your view? Wrong directions or dead ends?
Yeah, I know there's this tendency, I think partly because geography as a subject has been institutionally weak within the American system of higher education. People are always worried about the subject's future in that sense. Perhaps because I think of it more as an interdisciplinary exercise, I'm kind of rather less concerned about that. I see an enormous amount of interest in geographical perspectives on politics from people who are in a wide range of different fields, including geography itself. And of course, I think it's important that geography as a subject flourishes. But I think that I don't see any real causes for concern. There are trends that I may not find very interesting, or there are particular papers that, I might object to methodologically or theoretically. We can all engage in that kind of critique. But I find the subject matter, for example, in some of the major journals at the moment, really quite compelling. And I suppose I kind of like the variety of work rather than, everyone just doing the same thing. I subscribe to quite a few journals in political science and in sociology. And sociology, I think, has become a lot more interesting recently. Political science, if you get the American Political Science Review, and it's got a bit better too, I have to say, but there's a kind of methodological conformity, kind of tendency to want to, push everything into a particular model or a framework for doing research, which I think, in many ways, seems increasingly irrelevant to the kinds of political questions that many of us are interested in today. So I'm glad that we're more heterodox and less concerned to create some kind of conventional wisdom, even though that might be something one would be interested in. I find the liveliness of the discussions at the moment absolutely the sort of thing that I would like to see rather than a negative.
So you're one of those rare geographers who really has what I would call a canonical citation, which is the territorial trap, where if you write a paper you almost have to cite it, even if you don't engage the work. But that makes it sort of a leading question, but of your papers and projects, books, what would you like to see geographers still reading in 10, 20 years?
Yeah, well, it's interesting you mentioned that one. And in a way, I've written a couple of things since then that have revisited it. I think there was one in geopolitics in 2012 called "Revisiting the Territorial Trap," where some of the commentaries helped spell out, I think, better some of the arguments that I was trying to make in the paper, in a way better than I had. And so I think I'd like to see people read The Territorial Trap along with those commentaries from 2012. But the other, maybe there are two or three other things that I think where I've made some kind of contribution. One is a paper called Sovereignty Regimes, which later got turned into a book called Globalization and Sovereignty, which is now in its second edition from 2018, which kind of develops the territorial trap argument somewhat, but I see it rather than being a critique, it develops it in a kind of positive direction towards saying, well, if we're kind of stuck in this trap, how do we get out of it? So in a way that the Sovereignty Regimes paper is the beginning, anyway, of trying to do that, to think about states and sovereignty in a more Catholic, more nuanced and complex way than we typically have in the past. And then I think the other paper that I certainly still like and that stood the test of time is also from the mid-90s. Sovereignty Regimes, I think, was from 2003. It was originally given as a lecture to the Political Geography Specialty Group at the AAG in 1995, and it's called How Context Counts in Electoral Geography. And I think it's still a paper that has a lot to say, because I'm still quite interested in electoral studies and using electoral studies to make arguments about how place and space count in democratic politics. And so I think that will be the third paper I might identify as one I would hope to see people still seeing as having some relevance, sometime in the future.
Are there books or standard works from other scholars that you particularly enjoy returning to from time to time?
Oh, yes. I'm trying to think of some of the figures who've had the most influence on me. Someone who just died very recently, who I spoke to at great length on and off over the years, and who also published widely in relation to questions of territory and territoriality. And so on was John Rudgie, who was a professor of international relations at the Kennedy School at Harvard. And so he's someone whose work I've always valued. Another is Saskia Sassen, who's a sociologist who's at Columbia University. And again, someone I've had a lot of communication with over the years. And I think her book on authority, territory, and rights is just a brilliant piece of work. A third figure, again, these are all people who I think of as doing various forms of political geography, would be Charles Meyer, who's a historian at Harvard, who recently published a book which is very much about territory and borders and using those concepts really to interpret the long arc of history over the last 400 or 500 years. So somebody does a very kind of long-term macro history, whose work I think is just incredibly important. And then from within the discipline of geography, people whose work I go back to frequently would be figures like Jean Gottman, whose book, The Significance of Territory, I think is probably the most important book, or I think I can say this, the most important book ever written on territory, which appeared in 1972 and didn't get very much attention at the time at all from geographers or from anyone else. But more recently has really attracted a lot of attention. And then perhaps finally, a couple of other geographers whose work has been really important and often doesn't get enough attention, I think. One would be Bob Sack, who was at the University of Wisconsin Madison for years and, wrote some really important books that I've always found very helpful. His book on human territoriality, and then his book Homo Geographicus. I think these are just astoundingly important works. And then really even closer, in a sense, closer to home in terms of people whose work is perhaps closer to mine, my former academic advisor, Kevin Cox, who's still plugging away, has a blog, even though he's now in his early 80s. Peter Taylor, the British political geographer, those two, and then a former colleague of mine who I still do things with, Stuart Corbridge, who until recently was the Vice Chancellor at the University of Durham in England. So these would be some people whose work I value really very, very highly, and who I keep going back to.
So as you're well aware, our subdiscipline has long been sort of overrepresented by people who look like you and me, and underrepresented for scholars from the global South, women and others. That's changing, and I'm just wondering if you have any thoughts about, why it took so long, but also, opportunities and the future in that regard.
Well, a lot of it has to do with the history of universities and the, slow recruitment of people, particularly in the major English-speaking countries, into a field like geography. It's been difficult recruiting people. I mean, at a certain level. I mean, one understands why. I mean, I don't know about you, but my parents, wanted me to be a doctor or an engineer or something. The last thing that they had in mind was that I would become a university teacher of geography. And I think particularly that's been true for people from, typically underrepresented backgrounds, and until recently. So I think some of this is kind of demographic. I think some of it's also been about discrimination. There's no doubt about that. But geography as a field has always been quite strong in some countries other than the English-speaking ones. Brazil, for example, or I think of someone like Milton Santos, who has got lots of recognition in the 1980s and 1990s for his work. But much of that was very slow for his work to be translated, from Portuguese into English. I think only recently one of his major books has appeared in English. For many years I've had friends in Italy and France and in Germany and in Scandinavia. And they also too, I think, have often felt kind of on the outsides, partly because of the language barrier, which has become increasingly less. Partly I think conferences have changed. There's a lot more simultaneous translation, or efforts that people, when they present, the English speakers anyway, when they present at conferences, to present in a different kind of manner to make it more accessible. I think there have been a load of barriers, and I think it's great that these are finally breaking down, because I think it's contributed to a change in the way in which research is done, where it's done, which parts of the world it's done in. That we're breaking out of the kind of bubbles that we've been in for a long time, particularly the English language bubble, which I think has been particularly pernicious in many ways, where we take examples from the United States or from Britain or from some other English-speaking country, and then pretend as if they explain how things are working in other places as well. And yet the strength of geography as a field has always been that it's resisted, I think, this kind of, I don't know what, for want of a better term, I would call methodological nationalism, always just studying our people around here rather than trying to look at the world as a whole, or trying to understand how things are in other places. So I think it's been really positive that recently all kinds of different people from very different backgrounds have started to come into the field. A huge increase in the number of women. I think currently more than half our graduate students at UCLA are identified as female or transgender or gay. And I think all of the, I mean, this variance, I think, is showing up in the kinds of ways in which research is now being done, and the topics on which the research is being done.
So what other reflections do you have about political geography as an enterprise, about its past, present, or future that might help us with this project?
Yeah, well, some of these go back to the kind of work that I've done, which has been kind of critical of being so focused on some abstracted, idealized state, and that we need to sort of think more beyond the boundaries of some of the abstractions that we sometimes get captured by. I think one of the things that I've seen as being very healthy has been an attempt to center the main concepts of the field, like place and territory and space and spatiality and so on, in recent years, over the last 20 or 30 years. And I think that's a trend that I'd like to see continue, so that we don't get sort of always trapped in meanings of these terms that aren't particularly relevant to the processes that are operating in the world today. I think a second trend, and one that I'd like to see continue, is to focus much more on questions of governance outside of just thinking in terms of states, but in terms of international organizations, in terms of regionalisms within countries, in terms of alternative systems of governance like federalism, and how different models of federalism could be developed, not just at the so-called national scale, but globally as well. And this, of course, brings me to maybe the final thing, which is that I see us facing increasingly planetary problems or planetary issues. The obvious ones are like climate change and air pollution and so on and so forth. But a whole range of other questions that in a sense require looking at how we currently do things and more normatively asking, couldn't we manage these things better if we did things in a different way? And I think the pandemic over the last 2 or 3 years has brought attention to this. I've been writing a little bit about this, but there really is no country that really managed this pandemic very well at all. I mean, some slightly better than others, but across the board, it's been pretty disastrous. And a lot of it, I think, is down to a lack of international cooperation, a lack of thinking globally, and a tendency to just want to retreat behind walls, behind barriers at once in one way or another. And then, of course, blame somebody else for your problems, which is historically, of course, been one of the features of geopolitics. Foreigners are always to blame. When in fact, what we need to do is sort of own up to the fact that a lot of our problems now are collective ones, and they can't really be resolved it doesn't mean national governments can't be part of the solution. They can be. I'm not, thinking in terms of some kind of global utopia here. But they need at least to be working from similar scripts in managing things. And I think these are the kinds of questions and issues that political geographers ought to be addressing in the years to come.